Good evening, everybody. You are listening to a Radulich and Broadcasting premier podcast, The Alternative Commentary. And tonight, first, I am your host, the mandated reporter, and frankly, I'm mortified, Mr. Mark Radulich. And tonight, we're doing something a little bit different. We're calling this an alternative commentary for the infamous Montreal Screwjob, which was the main event between the Hitman, Bret Hart, and the Heartbreak Kid, Shawn Michaels, at the 1997 Survivor Series. But we're not actually going to watch the event like we've done with every other alternative commentary. We're just going to have a general conversation about it and kind of walk through the beginning, middle, and end, and from a fan's perspective, because at this point, the people involved in it, and some that were only tangentially involved, and some that weren't even involved at all but have an opinion about it, have talked this to death. But as fans, it's fun to go back and reflect on what we experienced as we watched it unfold and everything leading up to it. And this wasn't my idea. No. As I said, I am a man of the people. When the people contact me, I respond. Don't you understand? And when my good friend, my buddy, who's formerly of the Navy, formerly my concert buddy, the man I drove across state lines with, the man who said we can't go into Denny's because they don't serve redacted. Ladies and gentlemen, my good friend, who's already regretting the decision to contact me about this, Dave Giangrande. How do you do, sir?
We're doing all right. Doing all right. Like I was saying, before we came on, I made it a point not to watch the pay-per-view event again, because it would be, I thought it would be interesting to do it all from memory. And taking things steps back, like I said, when we were growing up, there were the kids that were all into wrestling, there were the kids that were all into sports. I was the sports kid, and it just seemed that in the late 80s that you were a sports fan, you kind of looked down on the wrestling fans, like, that stuff's fake. Why would you ever watch that? For the most rare exceptions, but that just seemed like what it was like growing up in that time. But this particular event and the WWE Attitude Era of wrestling and how great they are of expanding their market, they did an excellent job of bringing non-wrestling fans or non-aficionados into the fold to watch the weekly programs and going to the events. And this one was a big part of it.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, the Montreal Screwjob, I think, it almost creates modern wrestling, at least at that point. When you think about the years between 1995 and 1998, those are the NWO years. That's Scott Hall jumping over, and we Pat Mullen and I documented this on our history of WrestleMania. It was myself, Pat Mullen, Neil Blackwood, Stuart Lang. Depending on which show depending on which WrestleMania we've been talking about, and there were a few different ones, we documented the burgeoning Monday Night Wars, and this is right in the middle of that. If you think about the end of the New Generation and the beginning of Attitude, this is firmly in the middle of all that. And so, 1996, Scott Hall jumps over to WCW. He, jumps in the ring in the middle of a match, and he's like, where's Billionaire Ted? You know who I am, but you don't know why I'm here. And then shortly Kevin Nash comes over, and then they do Bash at the Beach, and Hulk Hogan turns on, becomes heel for the first time in his career, and the NWO is born. That's all the summer of 1996. That's between May and July. All that happens. And the WWE is still trying to, they've lost Kevin Nash now. He was a big deal. WrestleMania 12 in 1996 was Hitman versus Shawn Michaels, and now it's Shawn Michaels' yard, essentially. It's his time to shine. Bret Hart takes off for a while to go do, I think, Lonesome Dove. So at the same time, you have Shawn Michaels at the top of the company, and they're trying to adjust to him being, the Hulk Hogan of that era. You have all of this really fun and interesting stuff happening in WCW with his friends jumping ship. And that leads to 1997, where, you have a situation of the WWE trying to figure out what it's going to do. I mean, I think in 1995, during the Diesel years, things were financially so bad in the WWE. Like famously, they were removing water coolers. They couldn't afford to do raises. People were getting laid off. They were cutting staff. 1996, it gets a little bit better, but not significantly better. And in 1997, they're like, we're getting our asses beat by Nitro day in and day out. What are we going to do? And that's when they started That's when they started doing the D-Generation X stuff. That was the the Hart Foundation reuniting and doing like the anti-America pro-Canada thing. You have the rise of Steve Austin between 96 and 97, then his subsequent injury, which leads to him kicking and stunning McMahon, which is like, do you remember that? I'll let you back into the conversation here. Do you remember the night Steve Austin kicked and stunned Vince McMahon the very first time in Madison Square Garden?
When you bring it up, what comes to mind, I know this is way after, was the Monday Night Raw when Vince McMahon was a patient in the hospital and Steve Austin rips him over the head with a bedpan.
Yeah, that was way after. No, this was so SummerSlam 1997. Wait, 97. What a year in wrestling. SummerSlam 97. Owen Hart pile drives Steve Austin. He gets a stinger. He's paralyzed.
I just broke your neck. That's where that came from.
Mm-hmm. And so he can't wrestle, but they don't want to take him off television, so they just have him. So if you remember, they had him doing the thing where every week he would stun somebody new, and it built to him stunning. I think the gimmick was Vince McMahon came out and said, "Steve, we're taking you off TV for your own good. Give me the belts. We're taking you off TV," because at that point he was the Intercontinental Champion. And I think he might have been a Tag Team Champion too. Like, give me the belts. It'll be fine. We're taking you off TV for your own good. And Steve was like, I understand what you're trying to tell me, but you know what? You're a piece of trash. And then he stuns McMahon. And I remember I was at Madison Square Garden when that happened. I threw my pants, my penis, all of it, just the whole lower part of my body, just threw it in the ring. We all went crazy. That was the same night as when Mick Foley reemerged as Cactus Jack. You remember that at all? Yeah, he that was him versus Triple H, and they had the hardcore match for the very first time. You remember that?
See, I don't quite remember that, but we're getting to we're getting to that time frame where I began to start dipping my foot into the wrestling pool. And you bring up Austin. Austin was it. When he was the champion or the lead guy for that run of 98, 99, that's where it was full bore, where you had so many people like myself, non-wrestling, nowhere near aficionados absolutely flooding in to watch a bit habitually. Around the 97, the pay-per-views that stick out in my mind, when they were building up to WrestleMania where Austin took the belt from Shawn Michaels.
Yeah, that's 98.
Oh, wasn't it?
Yeah, okay. Here. No. WrestleMania 14 is 1998. That's Austin, Shawn Michaels. So let's go back. So 95 is Connecticut. That's Lawrence Taylor versus Bam Bam. And then Shawn Michaels versus Diesel.
Because I'm thinking of the one in the Fleet Center in Massachusetts, Austin.
1998.
That was 98?
That was 98, but yep.
So the one that we went to, the final climax in Philadelphia, that was 99?
Correct.
Huh.
Yeah, the Raging Climax was 99. So here, let's walk through it. I actually do want to ask you about your wrestling history, but let's lay out the timeline. 95 is basically the end of the new generation. That's the Diesel year. And he loses the title at the end of 95 back to Bret Hart. Bret Hart then loses it to Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania 12 in Anaheim in the Iron Man match. Shawn Michaels carries it for the next year, briefly loses it, but regains it back from Sid. And that takes us into WrestleMania 13, where Shawn prior to the WrestleMania 13 loses his smile. And you have the hot potato with the title that lands with the infamous submission match between Bret Hart and Steve Austin at WrestleMania 13, where Austin bled like a stuck pig, and Ken Shamrock was the ref.
Right, but he never tapped out.
Yeah, he never tapped out. He passed out. He didn't tap out. And then the headliner of that year was Sid versus The Undertaker for the title. That's 13. That's 1997. The Undertaker carries the title to SummerSlam. Shawn Michaels is the ref. Undertaker's wrestling Bret Hart. Shawn Michaels kicks The Undertaker accidentally in the face because he was aiming for Bret. And he has to count the pin. Bret regains the title. Bret carries it for a couple of months, and that takes us to Survivor Series, which is what we're going to talk about tonight. Let's take a brief pause for the cause here, David, because, you know, you talk about being a sports kid and a wrestling fan and all of that. So I was probably between like 5 and 7 when I discovered wrestling, and you and I, we're both Long Islanders. We both grew up in New York. So I didn't watch too much of the other territories. Like I didn't watch a lot of NWA. I didn't watch, you know, I don't think we even got championship wrestling from Georgia or Florida or anything like that. And then when it all became World Championship Wrestling, I didn't even start watching that until shortly before Scott Hall jumped over. So that's 1996. When did you start watching wrestling? How old were you?
We had already met. Because going back to grade school, my parents didn't allow me to watch wrestling. And you know, I really started to like sports going into middle school, and loved hockey, Giants football. It seemed to be that you had the kids that were sports fans, you had the kids that were wrestling fans, and a lot of us sports fans we myself included, would be snobby, like, why did you watch wrestling? It's fixed. Sport, you know, real sports is real. But you know, obviously, looking back now, you know, whether a person has spent an entire Sunday watching NFL football or whether they've watched a wrestling pay-per-view. In either case, that person has neither read nor written the next great American novel. It doesn't matter. But but there was something about the attitude era of wrestling that just totally expanded their market exponentially, bringing in non-wrestling fans into the fold.
So we have a mutual friend. That's how we met. I met our friend John, who I was podcasting with when I first started back in 2006. But we met in college. So college is 1998 through 2000. College is 1994 to 1998.
Yes.
And so I had to have met John probably 1996. And I think at that point I had just started, because I didn't watch it much in 95. So I had to have met him in 96, somewhere in the middle of college. And I think I had heard him and one of the other, maybe Pete or Tony, it might have been Tony, talking wrestling at the back of the classroom that I was in at the time. And because I inserted myself into their conversation. So John and I ended up becoming friends because of it. And of course, then John, now you knew John from Nassau Community College, right? Like you weren't friends before that.
Correct. And towards the end of his stint at Nassau Community College before he met you, he would invite, you know, folks over. His deal was, if you want to come over to watch a pay-per-view, you can, but don't don't be the one denouncing wrestling and don't be the
don't be the anti-wrestling douchebag. I remember the rule. Okay,
right,
so
which is fair enough. Yeah. And that's the thing. So I remember some of those first pay-per-views, The Rock still being Rocky Maivia in the Nation of Domination, and of course Survivor.
That's okay. So you had to have met him then. I guess so he's a year older than me, which means he was in college.
Well, I met him in 94, but I didn't start watching wrestling with him until at at least the end of 95, if not the beginning of 96.
Okay. So around the same. Okay. So now you met him from concerts, right? Because I think that's where he met all of his friends. Okay. So you weren't a big wrestling fan growing up. You started hanging out with John at concerts. John starts inviting people over to watch wrestling, and then I meet him at Old Westbury when he leaves Nassau, and then I start coming over, and that's where I meet you and that whole gang, and then we all kind of became a close-knit group of wrestling fans. That's about how that happened. Over the course of 96 to 98. All right, cool. So moving on. So now we know how we all got here. So you were in so you didn't really know about like the Hogan era, huh? Hogan and Savage, WrestleMania 3, all that. That was all alien to you.
Outside of the hip toss heard around the world with Andre the Giant.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was pretty much it because I never got to watch those pay-per-views. My parents wouldn't allow it.
All right, you're a strict Attitude Era guy, and that's just because that's when you started watching. Gotcha. All right, so going back to now 1997. So we're a bunch of friends, and we're all watching, and now we've seen the rise of Steve Austin. We've seen the rise of the NWO. We've seen the rise of D-Generation X, which is what. So on TV, we watched Shawn Michaels regain his smile, come back on television, and restart his feud with Bret Hart. Bret Hart forms a posse around him, the Hart Foundation. So he gets his brother back, gets Davey Boy, gets Jim the Anvil back on television, and then Flying Brian Pillman shortly before he dies. They're the Hart Foundation, and then you have Shawn Michaels palling around with what's left of his clique friends, Triple H, who is also then seconded by his bodyguard, Chyna. Talked about what happened at the SummerSlam, where Shawn kicked The Undertaker in the face. That leads to September, where Shawn and The Undertaker have their Ground Zero match, which ends in chaos. Do you remember this at all? They had him. This is one of the few times you see The Undertaker dive over the top rope, clear it entirely, and I think this might have been the one where he hit the cameraman. But it ended in just pandemonium. Like they were brawling through the crowd. They cleared out the locker room. They had to be dragged apart because that leads to the Hell in a Cell the following month.
Okay, there we go. Okay, yeah, the Hell in a Cell is what I remember.
Mm-hmm.
Where essentially Shawn Michaels' carcass was placed on top of the Undertaker, setting up the title match.
Yeah. So at this point, Bret Hart's feuding with the Patriot Del Wilkes. Nobody remembers it. Nobody cares. It was not the featured feud at that time in the fall of 1997. So the featured feud is The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels. So they have a 2-month thing, Ground Zero, and then Bad Blood, I think it was, with the very first ever Hell in the Cell. Which, do you remember the Hell in the Cell where Shawn Michaels is just kind of hanging at the top? And, looks, checks to make sure he's going to land in the right spot and proceeds to yeet himself off the side of the cage through the announce desk. And I think that's the one where JR was just yelling out, like, some idiot thinks, he knows how to fall.
It was matches like that. It was a long way from Jimmy Superfly Snuka.
It certainly was.
They just always seemed to raise the bar where you had to watch.
Yeah. And that's a really good point. I think we were all kind of glued to it because, again, that's why I brought up the NWO. You never knew who was going to jump over. You never knew who was going to jump back. You never knew what crazy thing you were going to see each week. I mean, the kind of shit. I mean, that was, if you'll remember, that was the same period as Pillman's Got a Gun. You remember this?
No.
By the way, if people listening or watching on YouTube later, take a drink every time I ask David if he remembers. You'll be blackout drunk by the end of this podcast. But do you remember when oh gosh, the Pillman's Got a Gun? This was 1996. This was like during Steve Austin stops being the ringmaster. He gets out of his feud with Savio Vega. He's now just now becoming Stone Cold Steve Austin, and he's in a feud with Brian Pillman. Go ahead.
Was this before or after Austin won at King of the Ring?
After.
Okay.
Because that was really when he became Steve Austin in earnest, Stone Cold.
Because I remember it back then, the winner of King of the Ring was really being groomed to either be the next champion or to feud in the title match.
That's the way it would be for years to come. If I remember correctly, the Steve Austin Brian Pillman thing was Brian Pillman was legitimately legitimately re-injured his ankle. They did an angle on Raw where he got Pillmanized, which is Steve put the chair on his ankle and jumped on it and broke his ankle again. So Pillman's at home, and they're doing like a satellite interview with him in his home, and Steve Austin keeps threatening to come to his home and beat the crap out of him and finish the job. At which point Pillman pulls a gun out and says, "I'll be ready for Steve Austin when he gets here." You don't remember that, huh?
That I would have remembered. Of course, I always remember his catchphrase, Brian Pillman, he don't dial 911.
That's right. Pillman 9mm. That's Austin 316 and Pillman 9mm.
Right. He played the NFL as well.
Yeah, he played for the Cincinnati Bengals. Yep.
Right.
So anyway,
which also meant he played with the local Long Island legend Boomer Esiason of East Islip.
Oh, there you go. There's some trivia I didn't know. So anyway, so you have Brian Pillman and the Hart family as one group, and you have DX as the other group. And then over the course of the fall of '97, and really over the summer, DX had been feuding with the Hart Foundation, but they kept Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels kind of away from each other, at least in the ring. It was a lot of taunting and carrying on back and forth. But for the most part, I don't think they ever actually touched outside of maybe... no, it wasn't Spring Stampede or Canadian Stampede. He wasn't in that one. In any case, this all builds towards the 1997 Survivor Series, where we're finally going to see Bret the Hitman Hart take on Shawn Michaels, and Shawn Michaels is slated to win, and then he's going to carry the title into 1998 and take on and drop it to Steve Austin, and the Austin era will begin. That was the plan on paper, more or less, as I recall. But you know what's going on behind the scenes during all of this is, I want to say in '96, Bret Hart basically threatened to leave, and the story that I've read numerous times, it's been talked about in documentaries, been talked to death, is that they re-signed Bret Hart for some sort of ridiculous 20-year contract, where he would be paid as an active wrestler for a while. And then he would collect a salary for being like an agent, but he would be with the WWE for 20 years. And like a year into it, they were like, yeah, we can't afford to pay this anymore, which I've always suspected. And I'm curious to get your take on this. I don't know how much inside. Hang on. I don't know how much inside you knew about wrestling at the time or now know, but I've always suspected that Vince saw what was happening in WCW, saw what was happening in the WWE, realized Bret was going to be a pill about the whole thing and was just looking for a reason to get rid of him. Like, I don't think it was a matter of they couldn't pay the contract. I think Vince just didn't see the value in Bret Hart anymore because they were going in a more like adult, as they would call it, attitude type era. What do you think?
Well, I didn't have any inside information, and if anything, you were my insider. But I do remember the Wrestling in Shadows documentary, and talking with other fans and this and that. And from what I understood is that Bret was trying to hold the McMahons over a barrel, figuring, you need me to stay. I'm your top guy.
Right.
Pay me what I want or else. Not knowing the exact parameters, but that's what I thought. And I figure, I'm guessing that the McMahons no one man is bigger than the company. You're not going to hold this over. You're not going to hold this over a barrel. Nobody is.
Right.
Which is what precipitated what we saw at the Survivor Series, and that's what really draws. And I don't know, not just me, but a lot of other people in, because there was such an element of reality with this particular match.
Yeah, and that's what I want to get to. So we can talk about the match in a second. I just want to lay the foundation. Yeah. So, they don't want whatever story you believe. Ultimately, they were like, we're not gonna pay this contract out. Go see if you can get a better offer from WCW. So he does, and his contract ends like December 1st, I think it is. So it didn't end at like the next day after the Survivor Series. Like, he absolutely was still under contract, I think, for like another week or two, if I remember correctly.
But if I remember too, a big part of it was, Vince McMahon and them saying, we can't have you going to the other wrestling circuit with our belt.
Well, yeah, they'd already they had forgotten Medusa still, or Alundra Blaze still had the women's title. She fucking threw it in the fucking trash on live television, which she has since regretted. So they were like, well, we're not going to let that happen again. Like. Right. And I get, and I think even I like in the next day, when after the Survivor Series, they did a whole thing on Nitro where they opened up, like the NWO opened up singing "Oh Canada." Like there was just a lot of whatever the story was, there was just a lot of anxiety over what will happen if Bret's still the champion the day after the Survivor Series. So like they needed to get that belt off of him. I do need to talk about this because leading into so Bret signs with WCW. His last day, I think, is December 1st. So the more better wrestling historians will be like, no, it was this, not that. But ultimately, he was going to be gone in a week or two, no matter what. They needed to get the belt off of him. They needed to put it on Shawn. Shawn needs to drop it to Steve Austin. However, if you go back and watch the documentaries, read the books, hear the stories, look on the dirt sheets, there was an incident between Bret and Shawn where Bret, trying to mend fences with Shawn, they had been on the outs for a while, but Bret, trying to mend fences, said, I'll never hurt you. I will always treat you with respect in the ring, and I will put you over and do the right thing on the way out. And Shawn's like, great, I'll never do that for you. And like walks away. And Bret's like, you motherfucker. And like rightly so. Like, what a shit thing to say to somebody. So, Bret's like, okay, I'm never going to work with this guy again. That happened well before the Survivor Series. Like, I've talked about this with other people. This is why some people think this whole thing is a work, because how do you, knowing that happened, knowing that they had that conversation, then go ahead and book those two? Like, depending on whose story you believe, because Vince Russo said he's the one that came up with the screw job finish. Jim Cornette says that he did it. Triple H says he did it. Like, everyone's taking credit now for this. But I remember Jim Cornette specifically was like, why do we have to have Bret Hart versus Shawn Michaels? Why can't we just put the title on Shamrock? If we're just going to beat him anyway, who gives a shit? Because Bret had said, like, I'll put anyone over but Shawn. And I'm certainly not going to do it in Canada, which was dumb. That is the dumbest thing of all of this is this insistence that it not be in Canada. Like, just say you don't want to put the guy over, that he's a big baby and a shithead, and you don't want to work with him. Like the whole, like, I'm not doing this in Canada. I'm like, nobody believes that. In any case, I'm with the people who were like, just put the title on Shamrock already. But it doesn't matter. So there's this animosity between these two guys. Going into that match, Bret believed the finish was a non-finish. They were gonna have a schmoz, and that he was gonna walk out with the title and show up the next night on Raw and just like hand it over. Or
right, that's what I remember. And they showed that in the documentary, which is that documentary was supposed to be pro Bret. And you see where that was the decision. All right, we'll have DX interfere. Belt can't change hands via disqualification. Right. Have a ceremony where you turn the belt over on Raw the next night.
Yeah, which people have said, like, why don't you just piss in Vince McMahon's mouth if you're going to do that? Like, there was all kinds of things they could have done. They could have dropped it to Shamrock the next night. Whatever. They could have done an injury angle where they vacate the title and hold it up until December. Like, there were so many ways. If all you needed to do was get the belt on Shawn, boy, were there 101 other ways to do it. They were like religiously committed to this way, though. That's why when people like talk about the Montreal Screwjob as a work, I don't want to believe that, but there were times where I'm like, really? There was no other way, huh? There was people were just gonna like be religiously committed to this one way to do this.
Yeah,
seems a little worky to me.
And this is coming from a non-insider, and like I said, I've never been a wrestling aficionado, even though there was that stretch in the Attitude Era where I watched religiously and went to live events. It all looked legitimately disjointed, that things were not going according to plan.
Yeah, let's talk about the match now. So now everyone knows, and granted, if you're listening to this podcast, none of this was new information. We're just two friends kind of having a good old-fashioned conversation over a Celsius. So the match itself, I'm just going to give my brief thoughts on this, and I'll let you talk for a little while. I remember sitting with you and John and Jim and Jim's mop of a girlfriend, and I'm sorry, she never talked. That could have been a mannequin. I would never have known the difference. So I remember we were all watching, and again, like we knew somewhat what was happening, but not completely. And I remember watching that match between Bret and Shawn, and it looked stiff as shit. They've gone ahead and said since they were working, but they purposely worked like it was a shoot, and they were really messing each other up because it looked. All the credit in the world to Bret and Shawn, because if they were really working, boy, did they have me fooled. And I've seen a lot of wrestling in my time. They look like they were beating the shit out of each other. Like they look like they were potatoing each other a lot. Go ahead.
That was a part of it. Well, two things that stick out in my mind: the very, very end and the very, very beginning. Of course, we'll get to everything in the middle. But the two things that I really wanted to share: the very, very end was noticing on John's VCR clock how it said 9:52 p.m. when the WWE copyright symbol went on the screen, ending the program, as opposed to 10 p.m. And the very, very beginning, it's like, has the match started yet? Did they ring the bell? Because it took forever for the wrestlers to even get in the ring, and you could tell that looked disjointed. That did not look like it went to plan. And this is before Vince took on an on-screen role, and you could kind of read his lips saying, "Get in the ring." I remember that's the other thing I remember too, when we're sort of like, well, has the match even started yet? Even though they had come out and they were already, wrestling, sort of.
Yeah, it definitely had an air of like they were just barely keeping the lid on it. Like it felt, you could, even sitting in a basement in Long Island, New York, all the way to Montreal, it just, like, you could feel, not that to be cliche about it, but you could feel the electricity. Like, and this wasn't like excitement electricity. So I always compare this one because to me, and I don't know if you ever saw it, but like you could feel the air of hatred between John Cena and Rob Van Dam at ECW One Night Stand 2. But that wasn't barely contained chaos the way Montreal was. Like that crowd hated John Cena and would have torn him limb from limb if they could have. That crowd loved Rob Van Dam and desperately wanted him to win the title, which he does with the help of Edge. And it feels real. You know it's fake, but it feels real. This felt real, and it's fake, but it was different. This felt like they barely had control of the situation. Like they almost didn't have a match. I remember having the conversation with you guys. Like, does this feel odd to you? Like almost like they had to go out at gunpoint. And that's not what happened. They went out willingly, but it's still that whole match. You use the word disjointed. That whole match just felt like something was off. Like,
yes. Well, that's the thing. As I remember it, the whole match from beginning to end, the whole thing because let's be honest, you watch wrestling with any degree of consistency. During the break, this is what our WWE cameras caught. This is legitimately disjointed. Where you look at it and you see someone or several people have gone off the script, and now the people at the very top are scrambling to do damage control. That's what I got out of it. That this has gone off the rails, and Vince McMahon has created the powers that be have to do something to get it back on track.
Whether
you
go ahead.
Whether you're talking about how, because if I remember correctly too, Shawn Michaels got tossed over the guardrail into the audience, right?
Yeah, and look, and that happens fair enough, especially now. Now, like if you ever watch AEW, I don't know how much AEW you watch, if any, but they're fighting in the crowd like every match. Like if there's 9 matches on a pay-per-view, every match is in the crowd.
No, I know that, but in this case, you're talking about a Canadian crowd that will be largely backing Bret.
Yeah, but not only that, but it wasn't happening with alarming regularity back in 1997. If they went over the rail, it was a big deal. Because I remember reacting big to it then, like, oh my God, they went over the rail into the crowd. Like, it's a planned spot intellectually, but it feels like they had just lost their minds and were really brawling. Like, and all the credit in the world to Bret and Shawn for doing a convincing enough job that they could get smarks like us to believe that something's not right. Something stinks in the state of Denmark. I want to move to the finish. So,
okay.
We've already talked about how the match, it felt like there was a lot of potatoing. I would love to actually sit with Bret and Shawn and legitimately ask them, did you guys actually make contact with each other? Because it looked like you did. I remember I used to write for wrestling websites at the time, and I remember like writing about how real it looked and how it looked like they were really potatoing each other. That there was spit flying everywhere. Like, it looked legit. So I'd be curious, because Bret talks about, and I think he even talked about it with Wrestling with Shadows. It looks like he's full on kicking people in the face. And, like, you ever notice there's no footprint? There's no red mark, like, after he's hit somebody, like, because he's not really making contact. It just looks real. Right. So I'd be curious to see how close to real it got, if at all. But I mean, Shawn and Bret were clearly working up until the very end. So they do the Pat Patterson finish, where it's the reversal of the sharpshooter, and then just as and right before, literally like seconds before Bret's supposed to reverse it on him, Vince McMahon's like, ring the bell.
But we didn't see him.
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing. We, the viewers, we heard the bell, but we didn't see Vince McMahon actively.
Right, and we didn't know what was happening, and we're like, why is the bell ringing? Like, I remember we all looked legitimately confused.
Right, as were the commentators, Ross and them. They were legitimately confused, not like on the script, like, oh my goodness, what's happening? You could tell by their reaction that they legitimately did not know what was going on, and neither did we.
Right.
You hear the bell, you wonder why. Right. It's like, well, did he tap out? Did he not tap out? What?
And so if you read, like I said, if you know like the history behind this, if you've watched Dark Side of the Ring, like Shawn knew what was going to happen. They told him. They were like, get out, they're going to go into your spot. We're going to ring the bell. Don't act like you know what was happening. Shawn Michaels, what a scumbag. Because now he has to
he sold that, because
he totally did. That's my point. Like he's like throwing himself like over the ropes, like, come on, Vince, you motherfucker, how could you do this to us? Piece of shit. Like, he's such a liar.
But even before that, the way he doesn't celebrate, usually in all of those, no matter how the guy wins or retains the title, the first thing he does is turnbuckles, raises there's none of that. He didn't look like he knew that he had won.
What an acting job on behalf of Mike Hickenbottom, right? Like, you now have to sell that you didn't know. You have to act mad. Then you have to like listen to Vince be like, get out of the ring. And then you have to go unwillingly. But the whole time that this is bullshit. To me, that's the funny thing about the Montreal Screwjob to me. Like, the layers of drama involved. It's really funny. Like, especially like in retrospect now, look back on it and just kind of reflect with my buddy here. And as we're talking about it, just like, I know for years he said after that, because again, shortly he's going to go into hiatus. Like, his drug addiction gets worse after this, if I remember correctly. Like, it takes a while before him and former Nitro Girl Whisper, who becomes his wife, find Jesus and clean up. It's like years later. And I remember him talking about how there were a lot of things affecting him. This didn't help. And he lived with an enormous amount of guilt. Like, whatever he thought about Bret Hart, whatever consternation there was between the two of them, he still lived with an enormous amount of guilt for his role in this. So I don't want to beat him up too much, but it's hard for me to watch that and think about it now and be like, you're such a POS, though. It's hard to take anything Shawn Michaels says too seriously when you're that level of liar. He lies. He just straight up lies that whole time. Because then you see in the Wrestling with Shadows documentary afterwards, and and Bret's wife is like, he's screaming at him, and it was a Triple H.
God saw what you did here tonight.
Yes, and they're both like, us? No, we didn't know. How could we have known? Get the fuck out of here.
But I'll be honest, when it was going down, when we were watching it in real time, it did really appear to me that Shawn Michaels was just as befuddled as the rest of us. But
like I said,
it's
an award-winning performance.
Right. Well, one thing's for sure, Bret, obviously, I don't think I think all this, he was legitimately deceived, as were we, the viewers.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you. So let's just summarize what happens with Bret. So Bret's, they ring the bell and Bret's like, son of a bitch, and he talks about this with Wrestling with Shadows. This is not my interpretation. He literally legitimately says, son of a bitches, they got me. And then he throws a tantrum. He just throws a big giant man tantrum. Like they scurry Shawn Michaels out of the ring. He runs to the back with the belt. And then Bret spits on Vince. And then he goes outside. He trashes the monitors around the ring. He starts making WCW gestures with his hands, whatever. Then he goes in the back. Infamously, he takes a shower because he's got to, and he punches Vince McMahon in the face one time. And then it's done. He's gone. That's the end of it. None of this we saw on television. What we saw was they faded to black right after, and they showed a little bit of it the next night on Raw, but not a lot. And then subsequently, as they've done documentaries and whatnot on it, they've shown some of the footage, but not all of it. Certainly none of the other than Bret's wife and maybe a little bit of the locker room. You never saw you never saw Bret punch Vince. To this day,
right? Because usually with these, especially the weekly shows, they would say, "Oh, well, during the break, this is what our cameras caught behind the scene."
Yeah,
and you'd get the right. It was obviously scripted, and you get the full view of what happened. We never really see Bret Hart in Vince's eye, although we know what happened, and you don't see him give him the socking him one either.
Right. So as a fan, like, what is your reaction to? I mean, I'll set you up this way, telling you my whole thing with Bret. I don't feel sorry for Bret at all. I have said this many times. Anytime that I have had to address this on other podcasts, I do not feel sorry for Bret one single bit. Yes, Shawn Michaels is a shithead. And when Shawn Michaels is like, I'm never going to put you over. Okay. I understand where Bret's coming from. You're paid to do, you're paid to put on a performance. Your performance called for you to drop a title. That's the end of it for me. And or you should have quit. They knew they were going to do the Survivor Series match. If Bret was going to throw that much of a man tantrum about it, he should have said something to Vince well before day of.
Which is probably the impetus of why they did it this way.
Yeah. My whole thing with Bret is it's fake fighting. And this is why to this day I still make fun of Bret Hart. See, I don't think Shawn Michaels is a good guy, but I make more fun of Bret because he takes himself a little too seriously for my liking in a entertainment arena that's fake fighting. None of the titles are real. None of the fighting is real. None of this means anything. It's a performance. It's a performance. You're getting bent out of shape. Sport. Right. You're getting bent out of shape because the script says you lose. Good day. And you don't like it because you don't like the guy you're performing with. Probably a better way to go about doing this than what you did, which was basically be someone who you can't work with, you can't reason with. And I get, for me, and I know a lot of fans who might be listening to this be like, I don't understand your point, Radulich. My point is you have to be an adult. Sometimes you take one for the team. You should, be a professional. Do as you're told. Follow your script. And he couldn't do any of those things. And it results in this. But what do you think? Talk about Bret Hart for me.
I'll tell you this. I remember some years ago watching an interview of Vince McMahon when he was talking about when Vince McMahon's father was running the company when it was in its infancy. Mm-hmm. And how a big part of the show was the ring announcer, obviously long before Jim Ross and them and Lawler. And how important that of a component to the whole show was the guy announcing, bringing it to life for the audience, not even on television, just in the house. And he felt he was so important that within an hour of showtime, that he told Vince McMahon's father, "You either give me a new contract and pay me this much, or I'm out the door." And of course, he didn't cave, and he told his son Vince, "You ever call a match before? No. Well, you're doing it tonight. Learn it." That was, according to Vince McMahon, that was the one of the big building blocks of the company, or how they did business, is that you were never gonna hold them hostage, no matter how dire or how important anyone or anything was. And the fact that Bret Hart had spent so many years in this industry and around the McMahons, to think that he could do that, you only have yourself to blame. Also, piggybacking on your point, is it's theater, professional wrestling, emphasis on the word professional. Whatever is in the creative script, that's your part. You do it. And collect your check and go on with your business.
Right. Can you imagine, like, you're the villain in I can't remember the actor's name, but what's his nuts from Die Hard? Help me.
Hans.
Yeah, you're Hans from Die Hard, and like the script says, okay, and at this point you go out the window and fall to your death, and he's like, "Oh, I don't wanna. Bruce Willis is a fucking shithead. I don't want to do it. I should win."
Right. My plan is to take the helicopter and go to UNICEF, some global children's charity.
Right. I don't feel like I should have to lose this fight in Die Hard. Like, yeah, I can't take Bret seriously. Like, as bad, I think that's where I always land with this. Every time I've talked about this, I feel I process it, I hash it out. We go back, I have this back and forth with whoever it is I'm talking to, and I always land in the same spot. Shawn Michaels is a terrible human being. Bret's worse. Like, I cannot abide by Bret's behavior. I will always take Shawn Michaels' side to this, even though Shawn Michaels did a shitty thing. It's like, yes, he did a shitty thing in kind of response to Bret Hart's even shittier behavior.
Right, but yeah, Shawn Michaels, when it comes to being a professional wrestler, whatever they asked him to do for the show, he'll do, even if it was done begrudgingly. But he always understood what his job was, who he was, and what the job entailed.
Like, historically, it's said that he didn't really want to drop the title to Steve Austin, and The Undertaker was prepared to beat him to death if he didn't. He did it. He did it with messed up as his back was from the next Royal Rumble, the Royal Rumble 98, where he hits the casket. As messed up as his back was, as much pain as he's in. Like, I don't know if you remember. You weren't there at the Fleet Center. That was just me and John. But I remember watching that with John, and I've since gone back and rewatched it. Like, it's not a good match, and it's not a good match because Shawn can't get up for anything. Like, he's trying his level best. But, like, compare that to even in later years, his matches against The Undertaker right before he retired. You know, his matches against Kurt Angle or Chris Jericho. Like, he's in phenomenal shape. Like, even his comeback match. You were there with us at SummerSlam when he came back against Triple H, and they had their brawl, right? Where he wore the jeans and the boots.
There, at the Garden when Austin retained the title against The Undertaker.
No, that's SummerSlam 98. I was told. Yes. So I took my daughter to go see the stadium tour over the weekend. That was Motley Crue, Def Leppard, Poison, and Joan Jett. And, you know, bumper music in between bands. They were playing Highway to Hell. And I turned to the people in back of me going, picture it, August 1998.
We must have heard that song 5 times.
Oh my God. I never wanted to hear Highway to Hell ever again. That was the joys of seeing live wrestling. But yeah. No, this was years later.
That's the thing. That's also a part of
that SummerSlam was right before you and I left for Los Angeles. It was like that's the one where Brock beats The Rock, and Shawn Michaels comes back against Triple H, and they have their street fight. So you had to be there for that.
ICP had a performance. Connecticut Yankees performed, that's another example of how they've always found ways to give the fans what they want and expanded their market, because even if you didn't watch on a weekly basis, you go to the show, what they put up on the Jumbotron proceeding to hype up and catch you up to what's going on. You know.
All right.
And I also remember a year later when we were watching SummerSlam '98, and at the very end, when whoever it was didn't tap out with the sharpshooter and The Rock, when The Rock had the guy in the sharpshooter, and
it had to have been. If it was the '97. If it's the '97, no, you're thinking about the Survivor Series, and it's
that's the homage.
They had to redo the Montreal Screwjob the following year with The Rock and Mankind.
Yes, that's it. Yeah, Mankind had him the sharpshooter. Mankind didn't tap out, and I opened my mouth, but you totally said it. You're like, oh my God, they just how you just pointed out, they just totally referenced.
And they would do it a million more times after that because we can't forget any. All right, Dave, we've been talking for an hour now, so I'm going to give it to you for the final words here. I when you pitched me this idea, I was like, sure, we can do that. I don't know if I've talked about anything more than the Ultimate Warrior. This might be it. I might have talked the Montreal Screwjob to death, but you wanted to talk about it, and I enjoy talking to you. So I'll give you the final word here. Anything left unsaid? Any thoughts you want to share? Otherwise, we'll close out for the evening.
Well, it merits conversation, even for people who aren't all that interested in wrestling. The backstory, which wound up being the forefront of is quite intriguing.
Yeah,
you know, how we obviously know somebody, or if not more than one person, deviated, and there's double crossing, but it's not, it's not a part of the storyline. It's like what actually happened, sort of, and that's what makes it so fascinating. And when we were watching it, even if you were a novice fan just coming through the living room, you were just totally hooked in, trying to piece together what exactly is going on here.
It's funny because, like, in terms of how this affects them individually, it really doesn't. Bret goes to WCW. Even if the Montreal Screwjob never happens, he's still going to WCW. He still gets kicked in the head by Goldberg. He still retires because of concussions. Shawn Michaels, even if the Montreal Screwjob doesn't happen, he still gets the title. He still wrestles The Undertaker at the Royal Rumble. He still breaks his back on the casket. He still drops the title to Steve Austin. These guys are like ineffectual for the next couple of years, regardless. Like, the incident in and of itself is impactful in wrestling because it added to the you never know what's going to happen element. In terms of these guys' career, though, it has no impact. They still go on to do exactly what they did. Like, it's the Indiana Jones thing. I don't know if you've heard this, where they brought it up in the Big Bang Theory once, but they had to have gotten that from somewhere else. Where, like, if you take Indiana Jones out of the movie, it ends the exact same way. He is completely irrelevant to the plot. The Nazis still get the Ark. They still open the Ark. They still all die. If the Montreal Screwjob never happens, nothing changes other than that element of expect the unexpected in wrestling for at least a little bit of time. Well, which I think is an interesting takeaway from this whole thing, is like how effectual but ineffectual the whole Montreal Screwjob really is in the grand scheme of things.
Right. And I look from my point of view, especially, like I said, coming from a quote unquote non-wrestling fan, sort of, is that as big as the WWE was in 1997, and was big, a mere 2 years later, it had grown exponentially in leaps and bounds.
Oh yeah.
And I believe this was a huge part of it. I know it wasn't long after this that I wound up watching Raw on a weekly basis, and going to live events when the opportunities came up.
Dennis Leary made a joke in his No Cure for Cancer comedy special where he's like, people asked why in the 70s we watched so much TV, because we had watched JFK get shot, we had watched Martin Luther King get shot, we watched Bobby Kennedy get shot on TV. Every time we turned on the TV, someone was getting shot. We didn't know who was going to get shot next. You had to watch. Because you never knew. And that was how, if somebody asked me to describe what it's like to be a fan during the Attitude Era, you had to watch. You had to watch during the Monday Night War. You never knew what was going to happen next. that is an element that has been sorely lacking in wrestling for about 20 years now. Like, if you
And
like,
it's funny that you say that, because since really the turn of the century, say 2002, 2003, I really haven't been watching.
Yeah, so me and my friends, we call ourselves the Podsmen. It's Chris Bailey, and my buddy Chris Sheehan, who also another Long Islander, currently residing in Arizona. And it's something that we reflect on a lot, about how wrestling hasn't been much must-see TV since the end of the Attitude Era, since the end of the Monday Night War, since the simulcast, where, I mean, in the wake of the WCW purchase by WWE, there's some still must-see moments. There's the night ECW invaded. There was the night that, I think Lance Storm and Mike Awesome jumped the rail, stuff like that. Booker T ran in, axe kicked somebody. But then the invasion happens. That sucks. And then it's just a lot of, the Steve Austin, Stephanie McMahon, Kurt Angle show for a while. And then it ends. Then the last cool thing that happens is the night before Survivor Series, Paul Heyman does his speech where he's like, "I wish death upon you, Vince McMahon." It's still one of my favorite monologues in the history of wrestling. I've like my daughter, who's like a musical theater person, and I've tried to teach to, appropriately do monologues for auditions. I was like, watch the Paul Heyman, pre-Survivor Series speech that he does. That's a perfect model. That's a perfect lesson in how to do a monologue. It's one of the best. It's one of the best pro wrestling interviews of all time. But shortly after the invasion ends, I can't think of. You have moments. You have the Nexus moments. You have the pipe bomb from CM Punk. You have certain things that happen. You definitely have your holy shit moments, but they're moments. And then, it's a pebble in the pond. It makes a ripple. The pond goes back to being still again. Throw another pebble in, makes a ripple, goes back to being still again. Whereas the Monday Night War was like standing on the beach and being hit by wave after wave after wave after wave. So that's it. That's all I have to say. That's all I have to say about that. You got anything else, Dave?
No. I think we got it. But yeah, 9:52 on the VCR clock. The copyright.
We're out of time. Stay tuned tomorrow to WCW Nitro. This has been the greatest night in the history of our sport. All right,
all
Dave.
Because someone wanted to be a superstar.
Oh yeah, he wouldn't put him over. All right, Dave. Hey, this was fun. I've never just got on and shot the shit before. Like, there's always some agenda of some sort. Like, we're reviewing a show. And they're just like, "Hey, you just want to talk about this wrestling match we watched once upon a time?" So this was fun.
We should do it again for metal. Shows that we were at but didn't know each other yet.
Send me a list. We'll work on a schedule. All right, buddy. I will talk to you soon.
You got it. Take it easy.
Have a good night.